Prepare to immerse yourself in a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. There's a name that still sends shivers down your spine in the ancient records of the Kentucky Appalachians, a name that carries with it secrets buried for over a century, whispered only in discreet conversations among those who know the true history of the mountains. That name is Isaac Harlow, and what happened that autumn of 1913 remains one of the most disturbing mysteries ever documented in the Appalachian region. Comment here where you're watching from, and if you've heard about the strange events that marked Kentucky during that dark time. The Kentucky Appalachians have always been a land of stark contrasts. Mountains that rise like natural walls, deep valleys where mist dances among ancient pines, and isolated communities that lived by their own unwritten laws. In the early 20th century, this region was even more remote than we can imagine today. Roads were little more than muddy trails, electricity was a distant luxury, and justice often arrived too late or not at all. It was a place where secrets could be kept forever, where the forest swallowed stories whole without a trace. Harlan County, located in the far southeast of Kentucky, was considered one of the most inhospitable and dangerous territories in the United States at the time. The coal industry was beginning to transform the landscape, attracting desperate workers and men fleeing their pasts. Small settlements sprang up around the mines, precarious wooden buildings housing entire families in miserable conditions. Violence was commonplace, land disputes ended in bloodshed, and the law of the strongest prevailed over any civil code. In this landscape of isolation and brutality, Isaac Harlow was just one face among hundreds, or so everyone believed. Isaac arrived in Harlan County in the spring of 1912, from somewhere in the east, perhaps Virginia or North Carolina, no one knew for sure. He was around 40, with dark hair already touched with gray, and pale blue eyes that seemed to pierce through your eyes when he looked at them. It was said that he had worked as a tobacco plantation foreman, then as a traveling merchant, and finally decided to settle in the mountains for a quieter life. He purchased a small plot of land near Cumberland, a secluded property surrounded by dense oak and hickory forests, far enough from town to guarantee absolute privacy. Isaac's closest neighbors lived nearly 3 miles away, and even these contacts were rare. He only came into town once a month to buy basic supplies: flour, salt, kerosene, ammunition for his rifle. He spoke little, always paid cash, and left before anyone tried to strike up a conversation. Some merchants commented on his reserved manner, but nothing particularly noteworthy. After all, lonely men were common in those mountains, people seeking to forget or be forgotten, and no one asked inappropriate questions. Life followed its slow, relentless course, the seasons changed, and Isaac Harlow seemed just another harmless hermit lost among the Appalachian peaks. But the autumn of 1913 brought disturbing changes. September arrived with its first frosts, tinting the leaves red and gold, and with it began the first strange reports. A farmer named Robert Watts told the county sheriff that he had found the remains of campfires in unusual spots in the forest, far from the familiar trails. The ashes were still warm, and around them were marks on the ground he could not identify. Another resident, a lumberjack named Thomas Green, swore he heard screams in the early morning, sounds that echoed through the mountains and then abruptly ceased, leaving only the heavy silence of the night. When he investigated the next morning, he found absolutely nothing, just trees and more trees stretching as far as the eye could see. Rumors began to circulate through Cumberland's taverns and churches. Some said it was simply wild animals, bears or panthers, that still inhabited the more remote regions. Others mentioned ancient stories, legends of the native peoples that warned of evil spirits that roamed the mountains at certain times of the year. But there were also those who whispered of something more sinister, something involving the solitary man who lived on the isolated property, the one with the pale eyes who rarely smiled. Isaac Harlow was beginning to become an object of suspicion, though no one had concrete proof of any wrongdoing. It was simply a feeling, a growing unease that settled in the chest of those who thought about him for too long. And then, in the first week of October, something happened that would change everything forever. A traveler vanished without a trace. His name was Benjamin Crawford, a 32-year-old draper who traveled the counties of eastern Kentucky, selling his wares from farm to farm, from town to town. Benjamin was known for his almost obsessive punctuality, always arriving at his appointed destinations on the exact date, keeping detailed records of his routes, and sending weekly letters to his wife in Lexington. When 3 weeks passed without any mail arriving, and when merchants in 2 different towns confirmed that he had never shown up for scheduled deliveries, his wife turned to the authorities, desperate for answers. Deputy Marcus Sullivan, a 58-year-old who had served as a law enforcement officer in Harlan County for over 2 decades, began the investigation with the limited efficiency of someone well acquainted with the hardships of that territory. Benjamin had last been seen in Cumberland on September 28th, buying provisions at Harold Peterson's grocery store. Witnesses confirmed that he seemed calm, discussed the cooling weather, and mentioned that he would follow the old Pioneer Trail north, passing through isolated homesteads before reaching the next settlement. It was a familiar, though rarely visited, route that cut through some of the densest areas of the Appalachian forest. Deputy Sullivan organized a search party of 12 local men, all experienced hunters who knew every rock and tree in those mountains. For 5 days they scoured the trail, examined abandoned campsites, and followed tracks that led nowhere. They found Benjamin's wagon about 10 miles north of Cumberland, partially hidden behind a cluster of moss-covered rocks. The horses were gone, likely taken by whoever was responsible for the disappearance or perhaps frightened away. Inside the wagon, the bolts of cloth remained intact, organized with the same meticulous care Benjamin displayed in all his dealings. His briefcase of documents was there, as were his personal belongings, even the cash he carried for business transactions, about $83 in bills and coins, remained hidden in the secret compartment beneath the driver's seat. Nothing had been stolen, and that made it all the more disturbing. If they had been common bandits, they would have taken the money, the horses, perhaps the fabrics to resell in some distant market. But there it all lay, abandoned as if Benjamin had simply dissolved into thin air. The search party expanded the perimeter, following in ever-widening circles around the wagon. It was veteran hunter William Porter who noticed the tracks in the ground, fresh ruts in the damp earth that led eastward, away from the main trail. The tracks were irregular, as if something heavy had been dragged through the undergrowth, breaking branches and crushing the grass that was beginning to yellow with the arrival of autumn. They followed that trail for nearly 2 miles through increasingly rugged terrain, climbing steep slopes where their feet slipped over exposed roots and loose rocks. The trail led directly toward Isaac Harlow's estate. When this realization became clear, a heavy silence fell over the group. Everyone knew the stories whispered in taverns, the reports of night screams, the mysterious campfires, but it was one thing to speculate safely over a mug of ale. It was quite another to face the very real possibility that something terrible was happening beneath the roof of that solitary, pale-eyed man. Sheriff Sullivan decided they couldn't simply trespass without more concrete, justifiable cause. The laws, even in this remote area, still required certain protocol. He and 3 other men drove to Isaac's house late that afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the mountain peaks, tinting the sky orange and purple. The property was even more isolated than Sullivan remembered from his last visit years before. A 2-story wooden house, solidly built but unassuming, with narrow windows and a wraparound porch. Surrounding it were a few smaller outbuildings, a barn, a storage room, a low building that appeared to be an old wine cellar or outbuilding. Isaac was on the porch when they arrived, sitting in a rocking chair, smoking a ceramic pipe. He rose slowly as the men approached, his pale blue eyes fixed on the sheriff with an expression impossible to read. Sullivan explained the situation, mentioned Benjamin Crawford's disappearance, and talked about the tracks leading in that direction. Isaac listened in silence, the pipe still clamped between his teeth, the smoke rising in lazy spirals. When the sheriff finished, Isaac simply said he hadn't seen any traders, hadn't encountered anyone on his land, and had lived alone for over a year without receiving visitors of any kind. His voice was calm, almost indifferent, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The sheriff asked if he could take a look around the property just to rule out any possibility. Isaac hesitated for a moment too long, his eyes roaming the faces of the 4 men accompanying him, all armed, all tense. Finally, he nodded, a barely perceptible movement of his head, and gestured that they were free to search wherever they pleased. But as he said this, his fingers gripped the handle of his pipe with a force that turned his knuckles white, and his jaw was so clenched that the veins in his neck stood out clearly beneath his skin, weathered by the mountain sun. The search of the property began as dusk shadows lengthened through the trees. Deputy Sullivan and his men searched the barn first, finding only rusty farm tools, sacks of grain stacked against the wooden wall, and cobwebs stretching from dark corners. The storeroom revealed little else: firewood cut for the winter, a few hunting snares, coiled ropes hanging from rusted hooks. It all seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of material any man living alone in the mountains would have accumulated over the months. But it was when they approached the low building at the back of the property that the atmosphere changed. It was an old structure partially sunk into the ground, with heavy wooden double doors locked by a thick chain and a padlock that looked far too new for such a dilapidated building. Isaac, who had been watching them from a distance with his arms crossed, explained that he stored salted meat and provisions that needed to be kept at a low temperature there. He said the key to the padlock was inside the house, and that he would bring it in a moment. It took him an inordinate amount of time to return, and when he finally did return with the key, his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he unlocked the mechanism. The doors opened with a long creak that echoed through the silent estate. A stone staircase descended into the damp darkness of the basement. The smell emanating from it was strong, a mixture of earth, mold, and something else neither man could immediately identify. The sheriff descended first, holding an oil lantern that cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. The others followed, their steps cautious on the steps, made slippery by the constant dampness. Down below, the space was larger than they expected, a subterranean chamber with a low ceiling supported by wooden beams darkened by time. Shelves lined the walls, and on them rested ceramic jars, cloth bags tied with twine, and yes, joints of meat hanging from hooks attached to the beams above. Everything appeared to be in order, nothing suspicious or out of the ordinary. Sullivan examined the jars more closely, finding pickled vegetables, coarse salt, and dried grains. The hanging meat was clearly game, likely venison or wild boar properly preserved. One of the men, Hunter Porter, inspected the pieces with an experienced eye and confirmed that they were just normal provisions for someone preparing for the harsh Appalachian winter. They climbed back to the surface without finding anything concrete, but the feeling of unease lingered. Isaac watched with an unreadable expression, the now unlit pipe still clutched between his fingers. Deputy Sullivan thanked them for their cooperation and said they would continue searching for the missing merchant, but for now there was no reason to disturb him further. The men mounted their horses and rode off as night fell completely over the forest. On the way back to Cumberland, none of them said much, each lost in dark thoughts about that isolated property and the pale-eyed man who lived there alone. In the following days, the search for Benjamin Crawford continued without result. The sheriff expanded the investigation to neighboring counties, sending telegrams to police stations in Bell, Knox, and Leslie, describing the missing merchant and asking for any information to be reported immediately. Nothing emerged. It was as if Benjamin had been swallowed by the green vastness of the mountains, his footprints erased by some invisible force that left no trace to be followed. His wife traveled from Lexington in desperation, offering a $200 reward for any information leading to her husband's whereabouts. Posters were posted in every town and village in the region, but the weeks passed, and the silence remained absolute. Meanwhile, other incidents began to be reported. A farmer named Samuel Dutch reported that 3 of his sheep had disappeared overnight, with no signs of predator attack, no blood, no wool scattered across the pasture. They simply vanished, as if they had evaporated under the moonlight. Another resident, blacksmith James McAllister, reported finding strange footprints near his property, marks that didn't match any known animal in the area, nor the pattern of ordinary human boots. The footprints led from the road toward the mountains, and then mysteriously disappeared over a rocky surface where they could no longer be traced. Stories multiplied in nighttime conversations, taking on ever darker hues in the collective imagination. Some began avoiding certain trails after dark, locking their doors more carefully, keeping loaded rifles within easy reach. The atmosphere in Cumberland and the surrounding estates shifted, becoming heavy with suspicion and unspoken fear. And Isaac Harlow's name was always mentioned in hushed tones, accompanied by furtive glances, as if speaking it too loudly might summon something terrible from the depths of the forest. Autumn was advancing, transforming the landscape into shades of rust and gold. October drew to a close, and November brought the first snowfalls, covering the mountain peaks with a white blanket that gleamed in the pale sun. It was around this time that a journalist from Louisville, Edward Pritchard, arrived in Cumberland. He worked for the Courier-Journal and was interested in writing a story about the strange happenings in the region. Pritchard was about 35 years old, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and always carried a leather notebook where he meticulously recorded every detail, every testimony, every scrap of information he could gather. He stayed at the boarding house of Martha Williams, a widow who rented rooms to occasional travelers, and spent weeks interviewing locals. He spoke with Sheriff Sullivan, with the searchers, with merchants who knew Benjamin Crawford and Isaac Harlow. Pritchard was methodical, asked insightful questions, and noted even details others might consider irrelevant. He studied old maps of the area, researched Isaac's property in the county archives, and discovered that the land had belonged decades earlier to a pioneer family who had disappeared under circumstances never clarified during the 1870s. Edward Pritchard delved deep into the dusty records of Harlan County, spending entire days in the small office that served as the public archives. The documents were poorly organized, some damaged by humidity, others nearly illegible from the passage of time. But the journalist was persistent, and his dedication began to reveal disturbing patterns that had gone unnoticed for decades. He discovered that the property where Isaac Harlow lived had a dark history dating back to the region's earliest settlers, a succession of owners who invariably abandoned the place after just a few years, always under strange circumstances. The original Kellerman family had built the main house and outbuildings in 1868. They were 4 people: patriarch Johann Kellerman, his wife Margaret, and 2 hired hands whose names appeared only as initials on the deeds. In 1873, they all simply disappeared. Neighbors found the property abandoned, with furniture still in place, clothes hanging, and partially eaten food on the table. It was as if they had gone for a brief walk and never returned. No bodies were found, and no plausible explanation was offered. The land sat vacant for years until it was sold at public auction. The next owner was a miner named Thomas Ashford, who purchased the property in 1879. Ashford lived there for only 2 years before transferring the deed to a distant cousin and moving to Ohio without offering a clear reason. Pritchard managed to track down a letter Ashford had sent to a friend, serendipitously preserved in the archives of old correspondence. In the letter, the miner mentioned recurring nightmares, unexplained sounds echoing through the property in the wee hours of the morning, and a growing feeling that something was watching his movements as he worked in the fields. The letter concluded with a cryptic sentence: "There are memories buried in this land that should not be awakened." After Ashford, the property passed through 3 more owners over the following decades, none remaining for more than 5 years. All eventually sold or abandoned the place, and while the official reasons varied, from financial difficulties to health problems, Pritchard noted a consistent pattern of hasty departures and awkward silences. And then, in 1912, Isaac Harlow had purchased the land for a surprisingly low price, even considering the location's isolation and dark reputation. The journalist wondered if Isaac had known this history when he decided to settle there, or if there was some more obscure reason for his choice. Armed with this information, Pritchard decided he needed to confront Isaac directly. He rented a horse from the Cumberland stable and followed the trail to the secluded property on a cold November morning. Fresh snow covered the landscape in a thin layer that crunched under the animal's hooves. When he reached the house, he found Isaac in the yard, sawing firewood with precise mechanical movements. The man looked up at the sound of his approach, and his expression immediately hardened as he recognized the visitor as an outsider, likely bringing unwanted questions. Pritchard politely introduced himself, explaining that he was writing a story about the region and wanted to talk about life in the mountains, the hardships of isolation, and the area's ancient history. Isaac wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and replied that he had no interest in appearing in newspapers, that he preferred to maintain his privacy, and that the journalist would be better served talking to people in town. But Pritchard insisted, mentioning that he had researched the property's history and had been fascinated by the succession of owners over the years. He asked if Isaac didn't find it curious that so many people had abandoned the land. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. Isaac's jaw muscles tensed, his fingers tightened on the axe handle, and for a moment his pale eyes fixed on the journalist with an intensity bordering on open hostility. But then, as if a switch had been flicked, his expression softened forcibly. He said he knew nothing about the previous owners, that he had bought the place because it was cheap and secluded, exactly what he was looking for. As for the stories, he said they were just the superstitions of simple people who saw mysteries where there were only coincidences and common bad luck. Pritchard tried to ask more questions, But Isaac abruptly ended the conversation, saying he had work to do before the snow got worse. The journalist had no choice but to leave, but as he led his horse back along the trail, he turned one last time and saw Isaac still standing in the same spot, watching his departure with a rigid posture that belied the supposed indifference he had displayed. There was something deeply wrong here. Pritchard was certain of it now. It wasn't just the historical documents or the testimonies of local residents. It was something more visceral, an almost instinctive sense of danger that all animals possess when near a predator. Back in Cumberland, Pritchard shared his findings with Chief Sullivan. The two men talked for hours at the police station, reviewing all the known facts, trying to connect the scattered dots into a coherent narrative. Sullivan admitted he too felt suspicious about Isaac, but emphasized that suspicion was not proof of a crime. There was no body, no physical evidence of any wrongdoing, only suspicious circumstances and a succession of disturbing coincidences. The legal system, even in that remote territory, required more than intuition to justify a formal charge. But the journalist wasn't content to let the matter drop. He began interviewing more people, expanding his reach into neighboring counties, searching for any additional information that might shed light on the mystery. It was during one of these investigations that he stumbled upon something extraordinary. In a dusty Bell County archive, located more than 40 miles away, Pritchard discovered a police report from 1907 about the disappearance of a traveling salesman named Patrick O'Donnell. The man had last been seen following a trail that cut through similar territory to Harlan's and had never been found again. What made it truly shocking was a small marginal note in the report, nearly illegible due to the sloppy handwriting. It said a witness had mentioned seeing a lone man with light-colored eyes near the area where O'Donnell had disappeared, someone not from the area who seemed to be observing activity on the road. The discovery of that old report made Pritchard's blood run cold. He meticulously copied every word of the document, including the marginal note about the light-eyed man. The description was too vague to be conclusive, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. Patrick O'Donnell had disappeared in 1977, 5 years before Isaac Harlow supposedly arrived in Harlan County. But what if Isaac had already been in the region at that time, living under another name, moving through the mountains like a ghost without leaving any official records of his presence? The journalist expanded his research beyond Kentucky, sending telegrams to police stations and newspapers in neighboring states. He asked for information about unexplained disappearances of lone travelers over the past decade, especially cases involving merchants, street vendors, or people traveling isolated routes through the mountainous regions. Responses began to arrive over the following weeks, some dismissive, others intriguing, but 3 cases in particular caught his attention because of their disturbingly similar pattern. In 1944, an itinerant carpenter named David Hutchins had disappeared in the mountains of Western Virginia. His wagon had been found abandoned with all his tools still in place, no sign of a struggle, no plausible explanation. In 1999, a Methodist preacher named Elias Grant had disappeared while traveling among small congregations in eastern Tennessee. His Bible and personal belongings were discovered weeks later beside a trail, carefully arranged on a flat rock as if someone had left them there on purpose. And in 1911, just a year before Isaac appeared in Harlan, a Spanish-American war veteran named Luther Webb had disappeared in Lee County, Virginia, leaving behind only his horse tied to a tree and a knapsack containing his clothing and military service papers. None of these cases had been connected before because they occurred in different jurisdictions, separated by years and hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. But when Pritchard plotted them on a map, plotting their approximate locations, a jagged path began to emerge, an invisible trail that wound through the Appalachian Mountains, always in remote areas, always involving lone men traveling alone. And at the center of that geographic web, like a spider waiting patiently, was Isaac Harlow's property. The journalist took his findings to Sheriff Sullivan on a gray December afternoon, just as snow was beginning to fall again over Cumberland. The two men studied the map Pritchard had prepared, with pins marking each disappearance, red lines connecting the dots in a temporal progression that suggested deliberate movement across the landscape. Sullivan was a skeptic by nature, trained to trust concrete evidence rather than speculative theories, but even he couldn't deny the pattern emerging from the data, a sinister constellation of lives cut short and questions never answered. But the problem remained the same as it always had been. There was no tangible evidence. There were no bodies, No witnesses to actual crimes, only suspicious circumstances and coincidences that could be explained in other ways. Isaac Harlow had all the rights of a citizen, including the right not to be charged without substantial evidence. Sullivan knew that if he tried to obtain a more comprehensive search warrant based solely on Pritchard's theories, no judge in the state would approve it. They needed something more, something concrete that would justify a truly invasive investigation of the suspect's property and life. The answer came from an unexpected source. A hunter named Moses Freeman, who knew the Harlan Mountains better than any man alive, approached Deputy Sullivan in mid-December with a disturbing story. Freeman had been tracking a wounded elk through the hills north of Isaac's property when he found something strange. It was an area of disturbed ground, not quite a grave, but definitely dirt that had been recently turned over and then covered with leaves and twigs in a pattern that seemed deliberate, designed to conceal something. Freeman hadn't dug the site because he was alone and daylight was fading, but he mentally marked the location using natural landmarks: a finger-shaped rock formation, 3 pine trees killed by lightning, and a narrow stream running alongside. He drew a rough map for the sheriff, explaining how to get there, emphasizing that the disturbance in the ground wasn't natural, not the work of animals digging. There was a human intentionality there, something his hunting instinct immediately recognized as significant. Sullivan organized an expedition for the following morning. In addition to Freeman as a guide, he took 4 trusted men, all armed, all prepared for whatever they might encounter. Pritchard asked to accompany them, and after some hesitation, the sheriff agreed, as long as the journalist didn't interfere with official operations. They set off at dawn under a cloud-laden sky that promised more snow. The temperature was several degrees below zero, and the biting wind coming down from the mountains made the men bury their faces in their woolen scarves. The hike to the site took nearly 3 hours across uneven terrain. Freeman guided them with admirable precision, recognizing every landmark he had memorized, adjusting his course when necessary to compensate for the snow that obscured some of the landscape's details. Finally, they reached the finger-shaped rock formation, and from there they spotted the 3 dead pine trees. The stream ran nearby, its dark waters winding between ice-covered rocks. And there, among the trees, was the area of disturbed ground Freeman had described. It wasn't large, perhaps 2 meters by 1 meter, but someone had clearly worked the land. The leaves scattered on top were drier than those around them, indicating they had been brought from elsewhere. The branches arranged on top seemed purposefully placed, rather than naturally fallen. Sullivan distributed shovels they had brought, and the men began to dig carefully, removing layer after layer of frozen earth. With each shovelful, the tension grew, the silence broken only by the metallic sound of tools against the hard, stony ground. It didn't take long for them to find something. One of the men's shovels struck something that wasn't rock or root. A different hollow sound froze everyone instantly. Sullivan ordered them to proceed more cautiously, removing the earth with gloved hands when necessary. What emerged from the ground was cloth, a piece of waxed canvas darkened by moisture and earth. They continued digging around, outlining the shape of the buried object, and it soon became clear that it was a large bundle, tied with thick rope in several places. The sheriff ordered the package to be brought to the surface without opening it. 4 men worked together to lift the surprisingly heavy volume and place it on a flat, snow-covered area. Sullivan cut the ropes with his hunting knife. The fibers were stiff from the cold and age. When he slowly unfolded the canvas, he revealed what everyone had already feared they would find. They were human belongings, clothing, leather boots still in good condition, a wallet protected by an oiled leather case, and personal items someone had deemed important enough to carry. Pritchard immediately recognized the clothing description: a dark brown wool jacket, heavy-duty work pants, and leather suspenders with engraved metal buckles. It was exactly what Benjamin Crawford's wife had described her husband wearing on the day he left for the last time. The journalist felt his stomach churn as Sullivan carefully opened his wallet. Inside were business papers, fabric sales receipts, and a faded photograph of a man and a woman in front of a white house. On the back of the photo, written in faded ink, was the inscription, "Benjamin and Clara, summer of 1910. But there was no body. The bundle contained only the belongings, carefully arranged as if they were relics in a macabre museum. The clothes were folded, the boots cleaned of mud, everything repaired with disturbing meticulousness. It was as if whoever had buried them was preserving trophies, memories of something terrible that had happened. Freeman suggested they continue digging around the area, and Sullivan agreed. If the belongings were there, perhaps there were more. Perhaps they would finally find the definitive answer to Benjamin Crawford's fate. They expanded the excavation in concentric circles around the first find. The snow began to fall more heavily, thick white flakes that clung to the men's coats and hats as they worked. The wind increased in intensity, howling through the trees as if the mountain itself protested the revelation of its secrets. 2 hours of hard work revealed 3 more similar bundles, all buried at slightly different depths, all containing personal belongings, but no human remains. The second package contained heavy work clothes, carpentry tools wrapped in oiled rags to prevent rust, and a silver pocket watch with his initials engraved on the case. Sullivan carefully opened the watch and found an inscription on the inside. To David with eternal love, Sarah. The name David immediately reminded Pritchard of his research. David Hutchins, the itinerant carpenter who had disappeared in Virginia in 1904, almost 10 years earlier. But how had his belongings ended up there, buried in the Kentucky mountains, so far from where he had last been seen? The third package revealed even older items, stylish clothing dating back to the end of the previous century, a Bible with yellowed pages and handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting was elaborate, the kind taught in rigorous schools decades past. Some of the notes dated back to 1892. There was also a gold locket, containing 2 miniature portraits, a man with a thick beard and a woman with a stern expression, both dressed in Victorian fashion. No clear identification, but the age of the objects suggested the package might have been buried for more than 20 years. The fourth and final package contained carefully folded military uniforms, service medals in a velvet box already deteriorated by humidity, and army discharge papers dated 1902. The name on the papers was Luther Webb, the Spanish-American war veteran Pritchard had tracked down in his research, who disappeared in Lee County in 1911. Once again, the belongings of someone who had vanished far away, now gathered in this secret graveyard of stolen memories. Sullivan looked at the 4 packages lying side by side in the snow and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature. He was looking at physical evidence of multiple disappearances, objects that connected this isolated location to tragedies spanning years and hundreds of miles. But the most crucial piece was still missing. Where were the bodies? Why had only their belongings been buried there? And most importantly, how was Isaac Harlow involved in all of this, if at all? Freeman suggested they search other surrounding areas. If there was one hiding place, there might be others. But the snow was now falling so thickly that visibility was compromised, and the icy wind made it dangerous to remain on the mountain. Sullivan decided to return to Cumberland with the evidence they had collected and organize a more extensive search once the weather improved. The men repacked their belongings, this time to preserve them as official evidence, and began their descent as the storm intensified around them. The walk back was silent and tense. Each man was lost in dark thoughts about what these finds meant. Pritchard was already mentally writing the story that would shake not only Kentucky, but potentially the entire country. A possible predator operating in the Appalachian mountains for over a decade, collecting solitary victims like a macabre collector, burying their memories in secret graves, while the bodies remained hidden somewhere as yet undiscovered. It was a story of terrifying proportions, the kind of case that would go down in the annals of American crime. When they finally reached Cumberland at dusk, exhausted and freezing, they found the town in a state of turmoil. News travels fast in small communities, and although the search party had set out quietly in the morning, rumors were already circulating about what they were looking for. A small group of residents waited outside the police station, their faces anxious, wondering if anything had been found. Sullivan asked them to disperse, promising official information as soon as he had time to properly process the evidence. But curiosity and fear were palpable in the chilly night air. Inside the police station, the chief locked the packages in a secure room and called a meeting with Pritchard and his most trusted men. They needed to carefully decide their next steps. Confronting Isaac Harlow directly with these discoveries could alert him and give him the opportunity to flee or destroy further evidence. On the other hand, failing to act quickly could put other lives at risk if he were indeed responsible for the disappearances. It was a delicate situation that required both courage and strategy. Pritchard argued that they should obtain a comprehensive search warrant and thoroughly search Isaac's property, this time without warning, looking not only at visible buildings, but also for possible underground hiding places beyond the cellar they had already inspected. Sullivan agreed, but knew he would need to present the local judge with sufficient evidence to justify such a raid. The items found were compelling, but a skilled attorney could argue that they didn't prove Isaac's direct involvement, only that something terrible had happened in the area over the years. The solution came from an unexpected source. The next morning, as Sullivan prepared the documents to request the warrant, an elderly woman appeared at the police station asking to speak with the chief about an urgent matter. Her name was Edith Sawyer, 73 years old, and she lived on a small farm about 5 miles from Isaac Harlow's property. Edith was known locally as a reserved but respectable person, the widow of a miner who had died in a cave-in 20 years earlier. She rarely came to town, and her presence there on that cold morning drew immediate attention. Sullivan welcomed her into his office and offered her hot tea, which she accepted with trembling hands. For long minutes, Edith simply held the cup, staring into the steaming liquid as if summoning the courage to speak. Finally, in a low but firm voice, she began to tell something she had kept secret for over a year. She said that in the fall of 1912, shortly after Isaac Harlow had moved to the neighboring property, she had witnessed something strange during one of her morning walks to gather medicinal herbs in the woods. Edith explained that she used to wake before dawn and follow ancient trails she'd known since she was young, places where specific plants grew that she used to make traditional medicines. One such September morning, still dark, with only the faint light of the waning moon illuminating the path, she had heard voices coming from an unusual direction. Curious and a little worried, she followed the sounds and eventually spotted 2 figures in the middle of the forest. One of them carried a lantern, and from his posture and size, Edith was certain it was Isaac Harlow, though she couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light. The other figure seemed to be struggling, staggering, half dragged by the first man. Edith couldn't hear what they were saying, but the whole scene was deeply disturbing. She hid behind a clump of rocks, afraid of being discovered, and watched the 2 men move deeper into the forest, heading toward an area she knew was particularly dense and difficult to access. When the sounds faded completely and the flashlight's light was no longer visible, Edith ran back to her house in terror, locked all the doors and windows, and spent the rest of that night awake, listening to every sound in the forest. Sullivan asked why she hadn't reported the incident at the time. Edith lowered her eyes, embarrassed, and admitted she'd been afraid of being wrong, of causing trouble for a neighbor based only on vague impressions of a dark morning. Afraid of Isaac, too, if he found out she'd seen him, but mostly afraid of not being taken seriously, an elderly widow living alone, known for her traditional medicine practices that some in town viewed with suspicion. So she kept silent, trying to convince herself that she'd misinterpreted what she'd seen, that there was probably an innocent explanation. But in the months that followed, Edith couldn't forget that scene, and when rumors began about Benjamin Crawford's disappearance, when she heard stories about the searches and suspicions surrounding Isaac Harlow, guilt began to consume her. She knew she might have relevant information, but so much time had passed that she feared her testimony would be dismissed as the confused memories of an old woman. It was only when she heard through the town grapevine that something significant had been found in the woods that she finally summoned the courage to come to the police station and tell them what she knew. Pritchard, who was present during Edith's testimony, asked some careful questions. He was able to establish the date of the incident she witnessed as approximately September 26, 1912, just 2 days before Benjamin Crawford was last seen in Cumberland. He asked if she could show him the spot where she had seen the 2 men, and Edith, after hesitation, agreed that she could try to find the spot again, though she admitted it would be difficult after so much time, and with snow covering many of the natural landmarks she used for orientation. Sullivan thanked Edith for her courage in coming forward, and assured her that her testimony would be treated with the seriousness it deserved. After she left, promising to return the next day to guide them to the scene, the sheriff and the journalist discussed the implications of this new testimony. Although it was still circumstantial evidence combined with the belongings found on the mountain, an increasingly solid case was beginning to form against Isaac Harlow. A judge might be convinced that there was sufficient probable cause for a comprehensive search warrant. That afternoon, Sullivan prepared a detailed petition documenting the disappearances, the belongings found buried, Edith Sawyer's testimony, and the historical patterns Pritchard had uncovered in his research. He took the documents to Judge Harold Pemberton, a 62-year-old who had presided over the county court for 3 decades. Pemberton was known for his caution in legal matters, always insisting on proper procedures, even when local people clamored for swift justice. He carefully read each page of the petition, asked specific questions about the circumstances of each discovery, and finally, after nearly 2 hours of deliberation, agreed to issue the warrant. The legal document authorized Chief Sullivan and his deputies to conduct a thorough search of Isaac Harlow's property, including all structures, adjacent land, and any areas that could reasonably be expected to contain evidence related to the disappearances under investigation. The warrant was to be executed the following morning at dawn to minimize the chances of resistance or escape. Sullivan organized a group of 15 men, all reliable and experienced, many of them hunters familiar with the territory and prepared for any eventuality. Pritchard requested permission to accompany the operation, arguing that as a journalist, he had a responsibility to document events of public interest, especially something of potentially historic magnitude like this case. Sullivan initially resisted, citing concerns about security and interference with official proceedings. But Pritchard insisted, and the police chief eventually relented on one condition. The journalist would remain in the background at all times, would not interfere in any way with the searches, and would follow all instructions given by law enforcement officers. Pritchard immediately agreed, already imagining the pages he would write about that crucial morning. The night before the warrant was executed was restless for everyone involved. Sullivan barely slept, mentally replaying every detail of the plan, every possible complication. Pritchard lay awake in his room at the boarding house, taking notes by candlelight, organizing his observations of the past few months into a coherent narrative he would soon share with the world. And there on the secluded property, nestled among the mountains, lit only by the crescent moon peeking through scattered clouds, Isaac Harlow was also awake, though no one knew it at the time. Dawn arrived under a clear, cold sky, the kind of winter morning where every breath creates clouds of steam and the ground squeaks underfoot from the ice covering every surface. The 15 men gathered at the police station at 5 o'clock, checked their weapons and equipment, and received final instructions from Chief Sullivan. Edith Sawyer was also present, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, determined to fulfill her promise to show them the spot where she had witnessed the disturbing scene more than a year earlier. They would depart in 2 groups. The larger would head directly to Isaac's property to execute the warrant, while a smaller group would accompany Edith to the spot she remembered. They mounted their horses and set off as the first light of day began to tint the horizon pink and gold. The air was still, windless, and the silence of the snowy forest was almost eerie. Birds were silent that morning, as if even the animals sensed something significant was about to happen. The tension was palpable among the men, some checking and rechecking their weapons, others simply riding in silence with somber expressions. When the main group spotted Isaac Harlow's property emerging from the trees, Sullivan held up his hand, ordering them to halt. From there they could see the house, smoke rising from the chimney indicating someone was awake. There was no visible movement in the yard or around the outbuildings. Sullivan divided his men into 3 smaller groups, each with specific instructions. The first would surround the front of the house, the second would cover the back and outbuildings, and the third would remain positioned at the tree line to intercept any escape attempts. The operation was to be executed with precision and caution, but also with enough determination to give Isaac no time to react if he decided to resist. The deputy checked his revolver one last time, took a deep breath of the frigid morning air, and gave the signal to advance. The men moved with surprising silence considering their numbers, horses carefully guided to minimize the sound of their hooves on the packed snow. When they reached the courtyard, Sullivan dismounted and walked to the porch with 3 deputies flanking him, rifles ready, but pointed downward in a show of controlled force. He knocked on the heavy wooden door with a clenched fist, 3 loud knocks that echoed in the morning stillness. He waited, mentally counting to 10, and knocked again when there was no answer. From inside the house came the sound of heavy footsteps descending the stairs. The door opened slowly, revealing Isaac Harlow wearing only pants and an unbuttoned flannel shirt, his hair disheveled as if he had just woken up, but his pale blue eyes were wide awake, quickly scanning the deputy and the armed men around him. He showed no surprise, asked no questions. He simply stood there in the doorway, waiting for Sullivan to speak first, and there was something about that absolute calm that was more unsettling than any outburst of anger or fear could have been. Sullivan presented the warrant, explaining in a clear, formal voice that he had judicial authorization to conduct a thorough search of the property. Isaac took the document, his eyes skimming the lines of legal text, and then simply nodded and stepped back, holding the door open in silent invitation. He said only that he wouldn't interfere, that they would do what they needed to do, but his voice carried a tone that wasn't exactly cooperative, more like resignation, or perhaps even something close to dark amusement, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. The men entered the house methodically, starting on the ground floor. The main room was Spartan, with minimal and functional furnishings, a rustic wooden table, 4 mismatched chairs, an antique armoire against the wall. No decorations, no photographs, nothing to indicate personality or personal history. The kitchen revealed clean dishes stacked high, basic supplies on the shelves, a wood-burning stove still warm from the previous night's ashes. Everything was extraordinarily organized, almost obsessively tidy in a way that contrasted with the roughness expected of a hermit living alone in the mountains. The upper floor had 3 bedrooms. The first was clearly where Isaac slept, a narrow bed with blankets stretched out like a military sled, a chest at the foot containing neatly folded clothes, a basin of water on a stand. The second bedroom was completely empty, devoid of furniture. Nothing but dust accumulated in the corners. But the third bedroom made several men pause in the doorway, hesitant. The windows had been covered from the inside with nailed boards, completely blocking out any natural light. There was no bed or conventional furniture, just crude shelves built along every wall. And on these shelves lay objects, hundreds of them, pocket watches of various styles and eras, some still ticking with ghostly ticks that filled the silence, glasses of various shapes, round and oval lenses catching the dim light of the lanterns the men carried, Bibles and prayer books in time-worn leather covers, military medals arranged in orderly rows, old photographs in twisted metal frames, combs, razors, pocket knives, pipes, each item carefully positioned like pieces in a macabre museum exhibit. Pritchard, who had followed the group despite instructions to stay behind, felt bile rise in his throat as he gazed at the collection. He immediately recognized some of the items. The silver-initialed watch they had found buried was nearly identical to 3 others on the top shelf. The military medals matched the description of Luther Webb's belongings. There were photographs that clearly dated from different decades, portraits of men with Victorian beards, alongside more recent images of people dressed in new century styles. It was a gallery of victims, trophies collected over years, perhaps decades. Sullivan called Isaac upstairs to explain the room. The man climbed the stairs slowly, entered the claustrophobic space without hesitation, and stood there among his collections, the flashlight beam casting long shadows across his impassive face. When the deputy demanded an explanation, Isaac simply said he liked to collect old things, objects he found abandoned during his hikes in the mountains, items other people had left behind over the years. He said this in a monotone, emotionless voice, as if describing a perfectly ordinary hobby, but no one in the room believed that explanation. The sheer number of personal effects, the variety spanning decades, the meticulous care with which each piece was preserved and organized, all of it screamed a much more sinister truth. Sullivan ordered everything catalogued and removed as evidence. As his men began the tedious work of documenting each item, the sheriff decided it was time to explore the exterior more thoroughly, especially those areas that had not been adequately examined during the first cursory visit months earlier. They returned to the low building that served as a wine cellar, but this time they wouldn't be content with a cursory inspection. They descended once more into the subterranean chamber, and under the intense light of multiple flashlights, they began examining every inch of the stone walls. It was Deputy James Carver, a young man of only 24, but with the sharp eyes of someone who had grown up helping his father as a stonemason, who noticed something irregular. A section of the back wall looked slightly different, the mortar between the stones newer, the color not quite matching the rest of the ancient structure. They brought tools and began working on the wall with care but determination. After 20 minutes of effort, the stones began to give way, revealing them to be merely a thin facade, a false wall recently built to hide something behind. When they finally cleared enough space to pass through, their flashlights illuminated a narrow tunnel stretching horizontally into the mountain, supported by wooden beams that looked ancient but still solid. The air coming from it was heavy, damp, laden with the smell of earth and something else that made the men hesitate before entering. Sullivan looked at Isaac, who had been brought down and was being guarded by 2 armed deputies. He asked what was in the tunnel, where it led. Isaac didn't answer immediately, just stood there staring at the opening in the wall with the same blank expression he'd had since the men arrived. Finally, after a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, he said quietly, "Memories. Just memories of what was and can no longer be undone." The cryptic answer satisfied no one, but it also made it clear that Isaac wouldn't volunteer any useful information. Sullivan decided they needed to explore the tunnel, but he would do so with extreme caution. He selected 3 men to accompany him, including Pritchard, who insisted on going despite the sheriff's protests. The 4 lit extra flashlights, checked they had enough rope in case they needed to mark their way back, and entered the narrow passage with hearts pounding against their ribs. The tunnel ran relatively straight for about 30 meters before beginning to slope downward at a gentle angle. The walls were packed earth reinforced with planks at regular intervals, clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing, who had carefully planned this underground construction over considerable time. The smell grew stronger as they progressed, a combination of mold, deep damp, and something organically decaying that made their stomachs churn. After another 40 meters of curved walking beneath the low ceiling, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The flashlights revealed a roughly circular space, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a ceiling supported by an arrangement of beams forming a primitive dome-shaped structure. And there, along the walls, were shallow graves dug directly into the earthen floor. The flashlights trembled in the men's hands as the yellowish light revealed the full extent of the hidden chamber. There were 7 distinct depressions along the circular perimeter, each measuring approximately 2 meters long by half a meter wide. Some were empty, just dark holes in the damp earth. Others contained forms wrapped in canvas, similar to the ones they had found in the forest days before. The silence in the chamber was absolute, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 4 men and the occasional drip of water seeping through the layers of earth and rock above them. Sullivan approached the first occupied grave with slow, deliberate steps, as if part of him still hoped this was some kind of terrible mistake, that there would be a rational explanation that would make it all less monstrous. She knelt beside the bundle, and with hands that tried not to tremble, began to unfold the damp tarp. What emerged confirmed the worst fears of everyone present. They were human remains, preserved partially by the constant temperature and humidity of the subterranean environment, but unmistakably the remains of a person who had met their end in this forgotten place beneath the mountains. Pritchard turned and vomited violently in a corner of the chamber, his glasses fogging up as involuntary tears streamed down his face. The other 2 men froze, their flashlights swinging, causing shadows to dance grotesquely on the earthen walls. Sullivan, who had served in the law for decades and seen more than his share of human tragedy, felt something snap inside him. It wasn't just the discovery itself, but the cold meticulousness behind it, the careful planning, the years of practice that this tunnel and this chamber represented. They forced themselves to examine the other occupied graves, mentally documenting what they found because neither of them could write with their hands shaking so badly. Each bundle contained similar remains, in various stages of decomposition, suggesting deaths at different times. Sullivan counted 7 graves in total, 5 of them occupied, 2 still empty, awaiting future victims who, thanks to this discovery, would now never arrive. It was a secret cemetery maintained by a man who collected not only the objects that had belonged to the dead, but also their bodies, hiding them in the darkness beneath his own house. The climb back up the tunnel was silent, except for the sounds of men struggling to control their nausea and emotions. When they emerged into the main cellar, pale and visibly shaken, the other deputies waiting above immediately understood what they had been through. Sullivan ordered that no one else descend until appropriate personnel could be brought in to properly recover the remains and preserve the scene for a full investigation. Then he climbed the cellar stairs, staggering slightly, needing fresh air, needing to feel the sun on his face, even if it was the cold winter sun. Isaac Harlow remained in the yard under guard by 4 armed men, sitting on a log used for splitting firewood, his hands now handcuffed behind his back. When Sullivan approached him, the deputy had to consciously force himself not to simply strike that impassive face with his clenched fists. Instead, he stood there before the man, searching for the right words, trying to understand how a human being could do what Isaac had apparently done for so many years. Finally, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion, Sullivan asked why. Why do this? Why take the lives of people simply passing by, lonely travelers who had harmed no one? Isaac looked up for the first time since being handcuffed, and for the first time, too, something like genuine emotion flashed through those pale blue irises. It wasn't remorse, it wasn't guilt. It was something closer to wistful satisfaction, the look of someone finally able to talk about something they'd kept secret for too long. He began to speak, his voice almost dreamy, as if recalling distant, precious memories. He said it had started when he was much younger, still a teenager, in the North Carolina mountains where he had grown up. His first encounter had been with a Bible salesman who knocked on the door of the isolated cabin where he lived, with an alcoholic father who regularly beat him. Isaac was 16 at the time, and something inside him had simply snapped when the salesman smiled that condescending smile and began talking about salvation and redemption. The anger from years of abuse found a focus, and Isaac discovered that doing this, taking another human being's life, gave him a sense of power and control he had never experienced before. After that first one, there were others. He had learned to choose his victims carefully, always lone travelers, always people whose disappearances wouldn't cause immediate alarm, individuals without close family, or whose routes were unpredictable. He moved through the Appalachians like a ghost, never staying in one place long enough to arouse suspicion, always one step ahead of any investigation. The objects he collected were not just trophies, but memories, ways of keeping those people with him, of preserving the moments when he had wielded absolute power over their existence. When he bought the Harlow property, Isaac decided it would be his last outpost, the place where he could finally establish something permanent. He had built the tunnel and underground chamber over months, working mostly at night, removing the earth in small amounts and scattering it throughout the forest. No one had suspected because he lived completely isolated, with no neighbors close enough to notice his nocturnal activities, and so he had begun adding to his collection again, 1 or 2 a year, always with extreme care, always meticulously planning every detail. Sullivan listened in a growing silence of horror. There was no remorse in Isaac's words, no acknowledgement of the enormity of his actions. He spoke of murder as other men might speak of hunting or fishing, an activity that brought him satisfaction, something that was simply part of who he was. When he finally finished, a small, disturbing smile played at the corners of his lips, as if he were relieved to finally be able to share his story, to no longer have to carry those secrets alone. Pritchard, who had recovered enough to hear the confession, scribbled frantically in his notebook with hands still shaking. This was more than a news story. It was documentation of one of the most disturbing serial murder cases the United States had ever seen. Isaac Harlow was not just an opportunistic killer. He was a calculated predator who had operated in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains for over 20 years, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered families spanning hundreds of miles. As the sun rose higher in the sky, other men arrived at the estate, brought by messengers Sullivan had dispatched. Among them was the county coroner, a man named Arthur Brennan, who would have the grim task of examining the remains found in the tunnel and attempting to identify the victims. Judge Pemberton also arrived, wanting to see for himself the evidence that would justify what would surely be one of the most significant trials in Kentucky history. And residents of Cumberland arrived, drawn by the rumors already circulating through town, forming a silent and solemn group outside the estate, kept at a distance by the deputies, but clearly eager for news. Meanwhile, the smaller group, led by Edith Sawyer, had reached the spot in the woods where she had witnessed the disturbing scene more than a year earlier. With the help of daylight and experienced trackers, they were able to identify signs that had been obscured by snow and time. Marks on the trees, a pattern of broken branches that formed a rudimentary trail, and eventually another area of disturbed ground, similar to the one Moses Freeman had found days earlier. They dug carefully and found more buried belongings, this time including Benjamin Crawford's wallet with business documents and some cash, confirming that he had been one of Isaac's victims. When all the groups reconvened late that afternoon, the full magnitude of Isaac Harlow's case began to emerge. From the objects collected over the years and the remains found in the tunnel, it was estimated that he had murdered at least 15 people, possibly more. Some of the victims would never be identified, their names lost to time, their families never knowing what truly happened to their loved ones, who simply disappeared into the vastness of the mountains. Isaac Harlow was taken to the Harlan County Jail that same night, escorted by 12 armed men through streets where hundreds of residents gathered in heavy silence, watching the pale-eyed man pass by in a closed wagon. There was no riot, No threats of lynching, just the deep, unsettling silence of a community confronted with the reality that a monster had lived among them for over a year, camouflaged by the commonplace appearance of a solitary hermit. The windows of the houses were lit that night. More families than usual locked their doors with extra care, and parents hugged their children a little tighter before bed. In the following days, Isaac's property became a site of intensive investigation. Coroner Arthur Brennan worked tirelessly to examine the remains found in the underground tunnel, attempting to establish identities through clothing, personal items found with the bodies, and preserved physical characteristics. It was grim and meticulous work that revealed increasingly disturbing details about Isaac's methods. The victims had been killed in a variety of ways, always swift and efficient, demonstrating that despite the monstrous nature of his crimes, he did not seek to prolong suffering unnecessarily. For Isaac, the act itself seemed enough, an assertion of power and control over another human life. Pritchard spent weeks compiling his notes into a series of articles that were published not only in the Louisville Courier-Journal, but republished in newspapers across the country. The story of the Appalachian predator, as Isaac came to be known in the press, captured the nation's morbid imagination. Readers in distant cities read with horrified fascination about the man who had turned a remote Kentucky estate into a secret burial ground, who collected memories of his victims as others collected stamps or coins. The case raised disturbing questions about how many other places in the vast isolated regions of the United States might hide similar secrets, how many travelers who had disappeared over the years had been victims not of accidents or common bandits, but of calculated predators operating in the shadows. The trial of Isaac Harlow began in March of 1914 at the Harlan County Courthouse. It was a cold, rainy day when the proceedings began, the courtroom packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and others crowded outside in the steady rain, waiting for any scrap of news. The district attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Samuel Garrison, presented meticulously organized evidence, the belongings found buried in the woods, the objects collected in the locked room, the testimonies of Edith Sawyer and countless others who had noticed suspicious behavior over the months. And most devastatingly, Isaac's own confession, transcribed word for word by the clerks who had been present at the estate that fateful day. Isaac refused to defend himself or show any remorse. He sat in the dock with the same blank expression he had maintained since his arrest, answering questions only when forced to do so by the judge, his responses always brief and devoid of emotion. His lawyer, a young, court-appointed college graduate, attempted to plead insanity, suggesting that no person in their right mind could commit such acts. But the doctors called to evaluate him agreed that Isaac was perfectly sane, that he fully understood the nature of his actions and the legal consequences, but simply lacked remorse or empathy the way most human beings do. The verdict was reached after just 3 hours of jury deliberation, guilty of first-degree murder on multiple counts, with aggravating circumstances precluding any possibility of leniency. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in the county jail yard once all legal remedies had been exhausted. Isaac listened to the sentence without any visible reaction, simply nodding slightly, as if receiving confirmation of something he had already expected. He was led back to his cell, while the crowd outside raised a murmur that wasn't exactly celebration, but rather tense relief, the collective sense that at least that specific threat had been neutralized. During the months that followed, as he awaited execution, Isaac received few visitors. Pritchard was one of them, seeking to understand more deeply the mind of the man he had long pursued through research. In their conversations through the bars of his cell, Isaac spoke more openly about his brutal childhood, about his violent father and the mother who had abandoned the family when he was only 8. He spoke of growing up in deep isolation in the mountains, where violence was more common than kindness, where human life had relative value depending on who you were and how many resources you controlled. But even as he provided this context, Isaac never sought to excuse his actions, never suggested that he had been forced to become what he had become. The execution was scheduled for the first day of August, 1914. It was a clear, warm morning, the kind of day that seemed obscenely beautiful for the grim purpose it would bring. Isaac walked to the gallows with the same calm he had demonstrated from the beginning, refused the prayers offered by the prison chaplain, and when asked if he had any last words, simply said, "We are what the earth and time make us. I was what the mountains demanded I be." Then, as the sun rose over the distant peaks of the Appalachians, the trap sprang open, and Isaac Harlow ceased to exist, taking with him secrets he had never fully shared, victims whose names may never be known. The property where so many atrocities had occurred was eventually burned down by order of the county, an attempt to physically erase the evil that had been perpetrated there. The ashes were buried, and the land was declared unfit for human habitation. Over the following years, the forest slowly reclaimed the space, trees growing where the house had once stood, shrubs covering the stone foundations. Today, more than a century later, few still remember exactly where that place once stood, and those who do often prefer not to talk about it, as if silence could finally bury that dark history completely. But in the Harlan County archives, in the yellowed newspapers of 1914, and in memories passed down through generations, the name Isaac Harlow remains a haunting reminder, a reminder that monsters are real, that they can seem perfectly ordinary, and that they sometimes inhabit the most isolated and forgotten corners of our vast nation. A reminder, too, of the fragility of life when we venture alone into unknown territories, and of the importance of never forgetting those who disappeared into the shadows, whose stories deserve to be told even when they end in tragedy. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on the mysteries that still lurk in the dark corners of our history, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next cases we bring to light. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and if you knew anything about the disturbing events that marked the Kentucky Appalachians over a century ago. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, help us by liking this video so more people can learn the truth about Isaac Harlow and the lives he cut short in those silent, unforgiving mountains.